Oni bonjour, everybody. My name is Bailey Walkie. I'm the founder of Frayed Feathers and the host of the Frayed Feathers podcast. I support teams to create youth reconciliation strategies, and I have this podcast to inform youth responses across Canada. So today we are going to be talking about status quo youth engagements and how to move past them by asking the right questions. I've been working with young people for the past 13 years, from restorative justice to public policy and even hip hop dancing, and I'm here to tell you, based on my personal experience and professional experience, on how to not be tokenized by initiatives that don't respect you, really. And that's why I wanted to have this standing edition of the Frayed Feathers podcast, focusing on the strategy components that can be implemented by anybody. Like, as myself being a youth reconciliation strategy consultant, I have a lot of insight into kind of like the core, well, just the fundamentals of what makes a quality youth reconciliation strategy. And I feel like my introductory questionnaire that I ask people that want to make these strategies is a great questionnaire for young advocates, young leaders across Canada and the US, if you find yourself watching this, to ask these questions in the engagements that you attend, mainly because they're general questions, as in, like, everyone should, even people on the bottom of the totem pole, so to speak, should be able to answer these questions quite confidently. And if they can't, then I think that that should be raising some red flags for you. And I want to give young leaders across the country to the tools to do that. So, you know, what happens with youth engagements across Canada is that an initiative, put on by an organization, an institution, a business, or something, they want to engage youth. And I think a couple different things happen. Either the first thing, which I think happens in a government context, is that they didn't actually have to engage youth, or sorry, they don't want to engage youth, but they have to because they have a duty to consult Indigenous people, and so that can kind of run into some troubles. I've done a podcast on this in I think my third podcast edition, so you can go check that out if you're interested. But I think there's also the other end of the spectrum of, like, people who do youth responses and engagements, but they end up doing a bad job because they just don't know how to do it, not because they actually, like, have had intentions of not doing it well from the get-go. And so, as in my opinion, as a young leader, it's your job to work with the best in your community and not to divide your attention amongst initiatives that are, like, half committed. And I think I like the phrase half committed because, in both contexts of, the duty to consult, where, like, government is forced to engage Indigenous youth, so they will, they are half committed because they are committing to it. They are going to put on an event to engage youth. They might just not do it in the best way possible. And then on the other end of the spectrum, it's like you're half committed because if you're doing a youth response, if you got all the way to the point where you're actually directly engaging with young people, and you didn't do it right because you just don't know, in my opinion, I don't think you're actually that committed. I think you're half committed because there is ample amounts of reports and research online, gray literature and academic, that you could decipher what goes into a good Indigenous youth initiative. So, setting the stage. So, for young people getting into advocacy, what I'm seeing is that people get into it through 5 or so different ways. Okay, so the first one's school, so you have, like, an extracurricular. Hey, we're gonna do, like, a recycling group, or, we're gonna, I don't know, we're gonna fundraise for some local initiative, something like cool happens or whatever. So you dedicate your time there and you kind of get into the community. Maybe the school is partnering with, like, a local nonprofit, so you kind of get to meet some of the nonprofit people, and you're like, oh, okay, sweet. This is extracurriculars, this is volunteering. I don't know why I'm finger quoting volunteering as if it, like, doesn't exist or something. But anyway, the second part of it, which kind of touched on with the school example, is like your local nonprofit or grassroots group. Grassroots group might be example of, like, a neighborhood watch, or a individual advocate that wants to bring awareness about a certain thing. Maybe it's like, I don't know, I'm just thinking of provocative examples in right now, but I remember this one advocate back home, like they were talking about like safe sex, and they kind of use like shock approaches to like just essentially like show you genitalia, but like they wanted to get your attention with that and then be like, "Oh, it's just normal. It's a human thing." You know what I mean? Safe sex. Woohoo. You know what I mean? Stuff like that. So like your local nonprofit is probably not going to do some provocative approach like that or something, but nonetheless, they would probably have, some posters out. Maybe your family like requires some support, or just accesses support, I should say, from a local nonprofit. And so as a young person, you just kind of naturally get involved. You're like, oh, cool. You know, I'm here for this reason, but it turns out they have this like youth group or something like that, and then you go to that thing and you kind of get involved in advocacy that way. The third avenue is municipal government, so for example, like municipal government will be like, hey, we're going to change something about a park or something. We would like to engage young people about how they access the park. What would they like to see changed? And sometimes this is in the context of, we're going to take away a park and it's like public response, oh, we need to keep the park. But then in other parts of it's like, maybe the municipal government wants to make an improvement and stuff like that. So they want to do it the best way possible. So they engage young people into that. Or maybe the municipal government has been given a mandate to better engage young people. And so they're going to put together a youth advisory committee or something like that. So that could be really cool for somebody to get involved in. You get to see kind of some core operations of the municipal government in addition to just being able to not have. Well, you just get that valuable experience, really. I don't got to put it in a fancy way. Fourth reason, our fourth avenue is through social media. So, like people will get involved because one of their friends or a famous person they really like got involved or is like posting about something that they care about. I know like just recently um, I think it was on Instagram. I think it was Indigenous TV, and like there was like a famous actress who was wearing real animal hide on set, and like of this movie they're making. I'm sorry if this is if you're watching this and this is you. I just don't recall the details, but nonetheless, they were clarifying that like yes, these are real animals, but it's not like it doesn't come from like a place of animal cruelty. It's like this is my tradition. My people hunted these animals and they create this amazing clothing so we can live on, and like and they reciprocate by doing all these amazing other things for the animals, and like they have a reciprocal relationship. It's not just indigenous people taking and taking from animals. And so anyway, like if you're someone who's never been part of advocacy, maybe you're 14 years old, you watch this movie and then you just follow this person on Instagram and you're like, oh, people care about the fact that this person wears real animal hide. If you lived on a reservation surrounded by your traditional lifestyles, you may not assume that people feel a type of way about wearing animal hide or something like that. But, now you're like, oh, interesting. You know what I mean? And then lastly, avenues to get into advocacy is their friends. You know what I mean? So any which one of these four things, whether it's school, your local nonprofit slash grassroots group, your municipal government, or someone getting through learning through social media, their friends recruit them from one of these four things, right? So they'll be like, "Oh, I'm part of this youth advisory committee that put on by the municipal government. Let's go check that out." Or they'll be like, "Hey, I saw this person at the mall and they just had a big poster of genitals and they were talking about safe sex. I thought it was kind of weird at first, but after I talked to them, I realized that they were actually had a really good message. I think it's kind of that's interesting. Let's go talk to them, see what's going on. Like it's okay to be curious, and like a lot of things are unorthodox and sometimes they are provocative and whatever. But nonetheless, kind of digressing here, but that's the five ways in which I feel like young Indigenous people are getting into it. But here's the thing, it's like in all five of those paths, you don't really receive training. There's not like an official, like, would you like to be an advocate? Here's the five options. It's kind of just like, here's a poster, go see what's in this opportunity, and hopefully it sticks for you or something. Let me grab a piece of water here. A piece of water. Anyway, so to this point, my story personally, like how I got into it. I mean, firstly, I went to college to be a social service worker. So I kind of already knew that I wanted to work in nonprofits. I had an idea, whatever. But I grew up in Cornwall, Ontario, and there's not really a strong nonprofit presence there. I think we have like the Boys and Girls Club, and of course we have churches. Like there's a lot of faith-based groups around there, and they do some stuff for youth. But it's a retirement city for a reason, like our town. I don't know. It's about 46,000. It's not like necessarily a city, but nonetheless, the point is that like I didn't really have like an ecosystem of supports. So contrast, whenever I came to Toronto and I started getting involved in the First Peoples at Seneca office, because I went to Seneca College, and the First Peoples office is just like where like Indigenous students can go and get some supports and be around other Indigenous students, etc. I started to be exposed to like the ecosystem of supports that I could receive supports from. So, for example, there was like Mizwe Beak, which is like an Indigenous employment center. There was oh my God, I haven't lived in Toronto in a while, so I now, of course, it's blanking on me. Like there's like the hostel centers, so like you can receive these $90 workshop trainings. There's like Sick Kids Hospital that also puts on trainings. There's Inspire, which is like a grant service for Indigenous students, and learning about all these things I learned I learned them through accessing the supports. I was like, "Oh, I'm a broke college student. Oh, I can get a free bus pass if I just fill out this form. That's awesome. Oh, I can make thousands of dollars if I write this grant. Awesome, like." And so anyway, I started doing all that, and that was cool for me. And naturally, I wanted my friends to get all the benefits that I had or that I was getting. And so my homie, who was Métis, and we would skateboard together all the time, I was like, yo, like, let's go to this employment center. You can get a free bus pass, and every month you just come back and give them your old bus pass, and they give you another one. And I was like, dude, like, this is like the best. Like, anyway, so that like you could see that like I was passionate about nonprofits because like I was doing that for my college diploma. But then in receiving the supports from nonprofits and going on that advocacy journey, I wanted to bring my friends in. But what happened, and I don't think this is always the case, but for my case, is that like my friends mostly just cared about the honorarium based stuff. They're like, oh, cool, I can make like $50 going to this engagement. Like, I will do that engagement with you. That sounds awesome. I would love to have a free bus pass. But they're not going to be like dedicating their weekend evenings to going to a youth groups to better inform like the design of a program or something like that. But anyway, just like to kind of illustrate through my personal experience as like how one gets into this. And so, I want to move into the story of my first youth engagement ever. So I went downtown from North York, which is about like an hour transport or so, like that. And we went into this boardroom. It was to support a youth crisis helpline, but like the Indigenous perspective. They wanted to like make, they essentially wanted to advertise in their programming that they were like Indigenous centered, right? So like they wanted to like encourage Indigenous youth to use this service, because typically what happens with these services offered by government or just like a crown corporation or something like that is that Indigenous people tend to just not use them. This is not like an Indigenous youth specific thing, but even like the human rights code, you know what I mean? Like using like the human rights tribunal process to settle a human rights dispute. Indigenous people tend to not use these programs. And I think that there's like, I mean, let's just chalk it up to colonization because that's not the point of this podcast today. But nonetheless, that's why they wanted to engage Indigenous youth. They wanted to encourage more usage from Indigenous youth in their helpline. And so anyway, we go into this boardroom. There was like, I think there was six of us, and they had this glass wall, like a traditional like interrogation, like cops behind the glass wall thing. And I mean, they told us that they were behind the glass wall, but like just kind of weird if you think about it. Like you're engaging youth, nothing like incriminating or like like why are you observing us? I don't know. It just seemed odd. Like why do you need to observe us in doing this engagement? Like why don't you just come into the room? Weirdo. But anyway, so there was two facilitators. One was quite lively and really good at engaging youth. I think they really brought the energy, and that was great. And the other didn't really. I don't think they said a word the whole time. Like they seemed respectful. They were really nice and like kind of nodded whatever, but didn't talk. So it was just kind of weird. I don't think that's very like youth friendly. But anyway, so in this engagement, like they had some questions for us. We shared a lot. We used sticky notes and we put them on the board and we like filled this huge board, or this wall, I should say, not a board. And so anyway, I feel like the participants and myself included were really trying to explain the indigenous youth experience of healing, and like, in like our cultures and things, like kind of sharing that, in being able to practice our cultures, being able to share those experiences with other people, that can be very healing. And, one of those cultural practices we have in healing, or to heal, is to tell stories. And, I think we often think of storytelling as like transactional, right? Oh, let me tell you the story. This really funny thing happened, or let me tell you the story. I need you to know what I went through, or something like that. But you know, I think what we were trying to tell them was that like the story was the point. It wasn't to bring them to an end goal. It was rather that like in order to feel supported, we needed to be comfortable to share this story and just kind of like, how would I say this? Like, I think it was like as a way in bringing somebody to like share our story and like kind of pick up on how we say the story. I think that's what helps, what we feel is helpful for in people listening to us to understand us. So it's like, okay, they're telling me a story, but like when they talk about a certain person, like what's happening for them? When they talk about when they were wronged, what is their reaction to that afterwards? Like how is their voice changing? How is like, why are these things important? And I think that the engagement people running the engagement, I feel like they kind of received this as more like youth don't know how to stay on topic because they can't get to the point, and so therefore they kind of diverge in telling all these different stories. And so, I don't think they really understood the indigenous youth experience. I think they just like wanted to engage indigenous youth, and they weren't like really open-minded to hearing the way that we were wanting to provide our feedback. And I understand it's unorthodox. Like as a researcher myself, I'm a policy analyst in my day job, and like if you like you could see how I was like I had a hard time explaining what we were trying to say. But in but like that's the thing about engaging young people is like they don't have the professional expertise to engage you or to explain their ideas in a way that is meant to be for you to jot them down like a researcher would. You know what I mean? It's up to the researcher to meet those youth halfway and say, okay, what are they actually trying to tell me right now, even though I don't fully understand this, like in the moment, right? And so anyway, that's kind of where I was going at earlier, where like people are like half committed. It's like okay, like maybe you just don't know what's best for youth, but you can certainly try your best to kind of extrapolate going into it. But anyway, and so the whole point was that it's not venting, but rather just giving the listener the context to better understand somebody. And so, long story short, we got engaged for about an hour and some, and we filled like the whole wall of sticky notes, which is great. Okay. We received a $100 honorarium. And about a week later, we were sent a one page of the findings. And the thing is like the two paragraphs on these findings were so separated, like literally there was just like a huge gap in in the middle of the page, that they made space to like fill up this one pager. Okay. And there was like maybe like five like bullet points under like the second paragraph. and that was it. And we got engaged for an hour and a half, and I just feel like this was a typical status quo response because they got what they needed, which was confirmation that they engaged Indigenous youth. It wasn't that they actually wanted to move forward on anything that they were doing, that we were saying. Okay, so let me like kind of break down some status quo responses for you. So these are initiatives that are not pushing the boundaries and they are doing the same old thing, which will lead to the same results. This isn't necessarily a bad thing to do a status quo response because sometimes engagements are really as clear as simply requiring youth input. But in the context of youth policy and strategy development, there are a few times when engagement can be this simple and still be successful, in my opinion. So, policy is very complicated and requires some training beforehand. So, it's difficult to walk into a room of young Indigenous people who have never heard of your organization or institution and expect them to give you helpful feedback. So, this is why we can't have such a simple transactional relationship in the youth policy and reconciliation space because there needs to be an investment in the youth that you're engaging if you actually want to be able to move forward on the things that they're saying. Okay, so if so for you as the listener, if you want to be a young Indigenous leader in policy, you need to be able to identify the signs of a status quo response and respectfully eject yourself from all these circles. The reason I say this is because it's about protecting your energy. So, like if you deduce that an organization is not fully committed to youth reconciliation, then I'd advise you to find somebody who is and dedicate yourself fully to them. And so I want to provide you with some questions here that you can use directly, ask directly to people that you want to assess if they are doing a status quo response. Do they really want to move forward on this? And I'll kind of give you some reason, some rationale as to why these questions are effective. So, I've been engaging youth for the last 13 years, and what I see from poor youth responses is really a lack of preparation. I feel this is a symptom of not taking young people seriously, and I feel that there's a mentality that young people don't have clear expectations of when they are supposed to be engaged. And instead of setting the bar high for them, we just do less because they don't need to be amazing. And the reason why I think people feel this way is because young people are typically not decision makers and barely anything rides on the organization's or sorry. So young people are not usually decision makers and barely anything rides on their relationship with them for the organization to move forward. So there's just like a lack of respect in my opinion. Sorry, not sorry, I guess. And so, anyway, some examples of this might include lack of clear expectations before arriving, lack of honorarium or transportation funding. In lieu of honorariums, they're only offering small snacks, only getting to interact with one professional coordinating the engagement, no expectations of pre-reading material, and did not design a collaborative session, instead just going around in a circle and asking questions one by one. And so, some questions that can help you assess their commitment to Indigenous youth. Number one is, what are your public commitments to Indigenous youth? Like this will give you a clear idea of what they are mandated to do, as in what do they need to do? What is their goal, their whole institution's goal? And why are they engaging in this way? So, if their public commitment is like, we want to decrease the amount of Indigenous youth in government care, it's like, okay, that's your public commitment to youth. Why are you engaging us on whether we want juice boxes in our lunch or not? You know what I mean? I'm just like spitballing here. It's like, if you have a commitment to do one thing, why are you engaging us to do this? Like that's kind of the whole point. Like how does your mandate connect to this engagement right here? Because if they can't answer that, that's a big red flag. They shouldn't be engaging you just cuz. They should always have a clear reason as to why. Number two, what are your goals in working with Indigenous youth? Once again, be able to answer this clearly and succinctly. you're looking for anything more than being an advisor or an informer. If not, it's likely a status quo response, and you should consider your time management towards this initiative. Like, and I say, you're looking for anything that is an advisor, that is not an advisor or informer, because what happens is people will engage young people at either the very beginning or the very end of a project, and they'll say it's to inform or advise our project, okay? But if it's at the very beginning and not throughout, then they're not going to be able to iterate on what is going on like, you're not going to be able to implement edits on what's going on throughout the process. So, for example, if they're like, okay, we have this big suite of youth engagement information, but then they're just going to go make their own solution. They're going to be like, oh, based on our engagements and some of the research we've done, we've come up with this solution. But it's not really a youth-centered solution in that example, is it? I mean, yeah, sure, they engaged youth, but if it's being created by a bunch of middle-aged people after they've engaged the youth, I mean, like, is it really youth-centered? I think that's a question you should be asking yourself. So number three, what will be our expectations as the young Indigenous people and responsibilities to participate? So they should have very clear expectations for you. If your expectations are not clear right now, it is likely that you're not going to be doing anything important. I'm sorry to say it, but like, if it were important, they would be looking for candidates with certain characteristics. And maybe they are keeping that from you, but I highly doubt they're doing that just to scout. Number 4, are you providing honorariums? Okay, young Indigenous leaders should not feel sorry about asking for compensation. They, in fact, deserve it. And I've heard stories of youth being engaged for over a whole year and had like weekly meetings and had homework and was only given $100 over that whole year. It's absolutely unacceptable. I've also heard experiences of people having the opportunity to attend events and expected to pay their own accommodations, like in the form of transportation, food, and their hotel. Just absolutely ridiculous. Like, it's going to be like nearly $1,000 for this youth to attend. And like, anyway, silliness. Last question. Will we have opportunities to attend other meetings, conferences, and events your organization is attending or hosting? Because you should be getting professional development opportunities in addition to receiving honorariums, even if they are small. If the presenters are unprepared to answer this question, it is likely they haven't thought this far about how to best support you, but in my opinion, they should have. Once again, circling back to people being half committed, if you don't have answers to questions that young people might have, you are half committed. I don't care how much you care about youth reconciliation and you post about it online and it's in your soul and how much you read up on it. If you're not putting that same energy into your engagements and young people are not being, their time isn't being respected, then you need to go back to the drawing board and you need to prepare more to support these young people. Okay. And I think if you're listening to this podcast, you're likely a leader in your space. If you're a young Indigenous person, I highly recommend that you consider how you can ensure that you're committing your time to the best reconciliation initiatives in your community. And I'm not saying that they're all bad and a status quo response is not worth your time. But if you don't know that it's a status quo response and you commit like way more time and effort to this engagement that like anybody else would, well, just be mindful that like you probably won't get much in return. And maybe you think that status quo responses are a great training ground for you to get experience and like just kind of see how they go and this and that, whatever. Absolutely. Maybe you just want to make $50, $100 honorarium every now and again and just kind of go to a one-on-one meeting and just kind of like share some, dilly dally a bit, grab some granola bars, a little juicy box, and that's cool too. I know, like, that's what I did in college. Like, man, I was so broke. I was like, yes, they owe like $50 and like some lunch. Man, oh, that was good stuff. So anyway, sign up to my newsletter, connect with me on LinkedIn, follow me on Instagram. I'm around. I'm going to be launching a website. I've been saying this forever, but it's all coming together. I'm going to be at Gathering Our Voices 2025 in March. I'm going to drop a little video on that as it comes, and just kind of using the next little bit of the podcast to prepare for Gathering Our Voices. I know there's going to be like an influx of young Indigenous people who are going to see this channel for the first time. And I just want them to have like a plethora of resources and podcast editions to go through and just kind of sink their teeth into. So, yeah, so I'm kind of more focused on like supporting young Indigenous leaders and their kind of advocacy points right now. But eventually I'm going to circle back into more the high level policy, unpacking research reports and stuff like that. But right now, I just want to speak to my younger audience who is interested in getting into this work more often or more so. And yeah, that's it. Peace.